All right, welcome back. This is number 4, and we're going to finish up tonight with the story of Wilberforce. You remember that we left it in 1807 when Parliament finally, after many efforts, many efforts over some 15 or so years to accomplish the task of stopping the slave trade, that he finally, go ahead, Josh, that he finally was able to do so, and it was a monumental task indeed. So we're going to pick it up there at the date of 1807, because there is an entire story yet to be told. This is the chronology of events from study number 3. You remember that in 1787 he started that society for Society for the Reformation of Manners, following King George's repetition of his first proclamation. It was 2 years later that he introduced the first bill that was very modest. It was simply to define the number of slaves you could put on a boat, and thereby control the traffic in terms of its merciless conditions. 1797, he married Barbara Spooner. 1804, he helped to found the British and Foreign Bible Society. And 1807 is when Parliament ended the slave trade. Right in the middle of that, in 1796, he wrote his most significant composition. And the short title is A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians. It goes on. This was a book he wrote as an argument to wake up sleepy Anglicans from thinking that they were just fine and being Christian was no problem to them in terms of their choice of immorality and their choice of wickedness in business and the abuse that brought to slaves in one situation. It was meant to be a wake-up call. It was meant to be a book that pointedly attacked the kind of hypocrisy that was in the upper classes. And again, remember, he's targeting the upper classes. There's the full title. It started out just as a pamphlet, but by the time he was ready to publish it, it came up to almost 500 pages. And in those days, if you published anything Christian and you put your name to it, the publishers were not interested because they knew it would not sell. Wilberforce defied that tendency, saying, I'm not going to publish it anonymously, I'm not going to make up a name, I'm going to put my own name on it. The publisher only published a fistful of copies, but the book exploded. It took off in some amazing ways. It was the bestseller for 50 years in England. By 1826, there were 13 editions in different languages, 25 editions in America, translations in French, Dutch, and Spanish, and German. One historian says, never perhaps did any volume by a layman on a religious subject produce a deeper or more sudden effect. And as one who's near and dear to Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, I'm glad for the competition. Wilberforce's book was a manifesto, a clarion call to wake Christians to reclaim the role of the church in building a better culture and a better world. And the book is incisive in that way. Here are the chapters that break down the book in its finished form. Inadequate conceptions of the importance of Christianity, how far short you consider the Christian faith, and how little you give credit to it. The true corruption of the human nature. I've been looking, as I've read his biographies in 2 or 3 publications by different authors, I've been looking for Reformation kind of thinking. Don't see much of it. He was evangelical to the core, but his second chapter does speak of the depravity of man. And so that is very clearly there, as well as the providence of God. So there, he leans Reformed, if anything else. Chapter 3, the chief defects of the religious system on the bulk. His favorite term is the bulk of professed Christians. That's you guys, all you guys out there, he says, who think you're Christians, who pretend you're Christians, who go to church, and yet you are not Christians in the way you live and how you make your profit, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He says the bulk of Christians, that's his favorite attack phrase. He talks about the prevailing inadequate conceptions concerning the nature and strictness. When he uses the word strictness, he's talking about just simply the structure of practical Christianity. The excellence of Christianity, he holds it up and he says, this is what you have in the Christian faith. And he underscores it and works with trying to teach it to people. And then there's a couple of other chapters that deal with it in this apologetic kind of form. The book was, like I said, was received remarkably well and sent shockwaves through England and resulted in contributed to the transformation of culture and to the swaying of opinion regarding the slave trade. I chose this book for the men's Bible study this fall, and I was able to find an abbreviation of it, an abbreviated version of it. That's what's out on the table, a practical view of Christianity. But to tell you the truth, I've been pretty disappointed in it. The abbreviation is too abbreviate. It's too significantly cut down. And the language is very high and educated. It gives you a taste of his ability to speak on the floor, but to be honest with you, it's above the guy's ability to grasp, and so I have to translate it as we go along. And the guys have been very patient with me to hold in there, hang on in there, and we work through the things. But it's one very good example of how much more educated and much a wider vocabulary they had in their day than we have in ours. You want to see what abilities they had in terms of their grasp on the English language and their ability to express themselves. Pick up that shorter book and look at it. But don't get it confused with the one in the basket, which is his life story. And that one I commend. It's easy to read. It's written in contemporary language. So the slave trade stopped in England across the British Empire in 1807. But since then, it didn't. The whole business of slavery did not come to a stop. But in fact, it dramatically changed, and I want to explain that to you. The very thing that the parliamentary members were concerned about and afraid of happened, and that was that as soon as the British Empire stopped participating in the slave trade, the other nations picked it up and profited greatly and left England behind. So right away, it was monetarily punishing for the British Empire to do that. They jumped in to take over the market. The gradually improving conditions that Wilberforce had hoped for never came. He hoped that the whole idea of slavery would begin to dry up. If the flow of slaves across the Atlantic is disappearing, then maybe they'll just stop having slaves. Well, no, that didn't happen at all. The black market kicked in, and before you know it, you had privateers sending boats across, flying flags of their convenience. Whichever flag would get them into whatever port, they would put up, and they would be, and importing slaves continued in that fashion. British plantation owners realized that the trade had stopped, the flow of slaves had significantly been diminished, and so they just simply changed tactics. And this is an important aspect with regard to what happens in North America. The change in tactics was instead of regarding slaves as disposable workforce, work them until they drop. They said they changed it to a concept of reproducing. We'll just simply make babies, and we'll keep the population growing on our own. Now, that was immediately changed with pros and cons. Pros were you had to build villages, you had to build settlements for the slaves to stay in long term. Even if they were just hovels, they were nonetheless more than there were before. You had to allow for marriages or sexual unions. You had to allow for mothers to stay home with children or to have children taken care of in some way. You had to encourage the men to go back to the. I mean, you had to create an entire culture that you hadn't bothered with before. And this resulted in a couple of things, a positive and negative. A positive is that there was some increase in morale among the slaves, but having a village kind of concept also increased the amount of free time slaves would have. You had to leave them alone if they were going to do their thing. And the more free time the slaves had, the more ability they had to plot escapes and insurrections and things that were out of your control. And so that was when the more brutal treatment of slaves increased. Before, you would just kill them. You had a problem slave, you just kill them, just shoot them. But now you had to abuse them and keep them going. And so when you see all the pictures of plantation owners, first of all, when you see the majority of picture or artistic renditions of slaves being brutally treated, the majority of those are not North America. You need to understand that. The majority of them are depictions of things going on in the West Indies, in Central America, and in Brazil, where you have so many more slaves that need to be brought under control. But abuse of slaves, punishing runaway slaves, chaining them in place, chopping off hands so that they could keep working, all of that kind of thing that is in our mentality, the things we were taught about slavery, starts after the slave trade is done. Because the whole different mindset has begun. And they have to renew this, they have to renew the stock, they have to keep the ones they have. And so they have they hire specialty torture people who keep these, who break the spirit, if you will, and keep them in line. And yet at the same time, artists' renditions of this are getting out. Before, there wasn't too much of this. That's what, you remember, Great Britain was kept in the dark. Now the brutality is actually increased at home, and artist depictions of this brutality are starting to leak out and make the papers. And so the sympathies are starting to rise as well. We didn't see this before. Nobody told us about this. And so it's starting to work against the plantation owners. Now, at the same time, there's some stuff going on worldwide that you need to also be aware of. I like to keep a chronology flowing. 1807 is when the slave trade ends. You have the Napoleonic Wars, which to North Americans is still kind of a mystery. We don't completely understand the Napoleonic Wars, and there's a reason for that. But it goes on for those many years. In 1811, during all of that time, as Parliament is dealing with Napoleon and the wars that are going on, and Great Britain's involved in that, by now he is 52 and his body is starting to wear out. Remember, I said that he wasn't ever truly healthy. He was just a little man. He was frail. He had lots of issues physically, and now his body is already starting to wear out just a few years after he saw the accomplishment of the ceasing of slave trade. In 1812, the War of 1812 breaks out, and this is one quote I found that I thought was interesting. He says, ultimately, the war would be ended by the Treaty of Ghent in December of 1814, which committed both countries to use their best endeavors to put an end to the slave trade, but that didn't include the United States. They wouldn't go along with that. And by 1813, in the midst of the war, Wilberforce was again working with this conversion of culture, and the next thing he did was he went after the Catholic prejudice in England that went all the way back to Henry VIII. You might remember that when Henry VIII broke off from the Roman Catholic Church, he started the Anglican Church, and from then on, Catholics were non-starters in England. You didn't tell anybody if you were Catholic, and nobody wanted to hear if you're Catholic. They hated Catholics because they were always afraid the Catholics would take the country back. And this prejudice continued on now up to Wilberforce's day, and Wilberforce by 1830 participated in the great challenge to that prejudice. Said, we're beyond that now. We need to grow up. We need to accept. He said, I'm not a Catholic. I don't have any patience for Catholicism, but we cannot be just so prejudiced against these people that they can't even vote, they can't participate in government, they don't have many of the privileges that we do. That's got to stop. And so he went after this, and he was able to get emancipation for Catholics, and also to push for missionary representation in India. India was now one of the British colonies, and India had been assumed government over by Britain. They were running the Indian economy now and everything. And because it was a British colony, it had come to the attention of Parliament that the Indian people, being Hindu, were still practicing what they called the satay. Anybody know what the satay is? Whenever anybody of any prominence would die, they would burn the body on a funeral pyre, and the wife was expected to be consumed in the fire with him. And Wilberforce thought this was horrible. And he said, we have to change culture in India. Now here again, his vision of Christian worldview enlargement has no bounds. He doesn't just limit himself to slave trade in the British Empire. He is after a change in culture, and when he sees this in India, he says Hinduism has to be stopped. And so he actually is able to bring that to a close at the same year he achieves Catholic emancipation. Now, meanwhile in North America, let's go back and review a little bit about what I touched on 2 years ago and give you an eye-opening illustration of what's going on in the United States from the very beginning until now, until this point in Wilberforce's life. You all remember 1619, right? That was brought to your attention with the 1619 Project. When slavery was started, that evil thing was started by those wicked Virginians and everything. Well, the real story to 1619 goes like this. There were 20 or so Angolan captives, who arrived in the British colony of Jamestown in 1619 and were purchased by the colonists. That's the story. But they were originally captured by that country that has always led the way in European slavery, the Portuguese. Originally, they were captured in Africa, in Angola, by the Portuguese, and they sailed on, headed for Central America. They were not headed for North America at all. They were going down to Central America where they could sell for a premium. During that crossing, an exorbitant amount of their cargo died. Out of 350 slaves, 150 of them died. The conditions on the ship were brutal. The ship was then attacked on the way by privateers. Privateers who would come, attack, seize the ship, take whatever they want, sink the boat, kill anybody they didn't like, which would include many of the slaves. They kidnapped 60, however, put them on board their own ship and a group of ships, and one of those privateers eventually wound up on the coast of Virginia with 20 more slaves. 20 captives, I'll put it that way. They aren't slaves yet. 20 captives. The artist's rendition up there I don't know if it's accurate or not, but I can imagine the condition that these captives were in. They were probably children. They were probably women. They were probably sick. The reason that they're being dumped off on the shore of Virginia is because the privateers didn't want them anymore. And I'm sure they put it to the colonists, if you don't buy them, they're toast. And I would be willing to gamble, if I was a gambling man, that the reason they bought those captives were because they were Christians and did not want them to perish at the hands of the privateers. When slavery did get a foothold in North America, they were first treated not as slaves were in Central America and in Brazil and the West Indies. In other words, used up and killed or died. They were treated as indentured servants. That again speaks to me about volumes, about the original motivations of the Jamestown colonists. You remember an indentured servant would work for a certain number of years, 7, 10 years, and then they would be released. You pay for your redemption, and then you're released. And that was the original agreement. That was the original plan when slavery began to be practiced in North America. However, of course, as time goes on and perhaps that first generation passes, grandfather bought them, and then my father took over after grandfather died, and he didn't quite remember the indentured arrangement that grandfather had made with him. And I don't remember how many years you've worked here. Why don't you work a few more? And so the release of the captives, of the slaves, began to be lengthened and delayed for the benefit of the owners. So more and more of the Africans were required to work past their time limit. Of course, it also helps that they couldn't count. How many years you been here? I don't know. Master, you have to tell me. That was, by 1640, now it's been 21 years since that first incident. 1640, this is important, I think. 1640, a Virginia court sentences a certain slave, name is John Punch, to a lifetime of servitude. Well, wait a minute, I thought slaves were always lifetime. No, indentured servants. This was punishment given to him for some rebellion he had brought on himself. And the punishment was, you're never going to be free, you're going to be a slave for the rest of your life. 22 years later, another such case comes before the Virginia court, and it has to do with the children that are now being raised, populated and raised by him, and the court makes the decision that will eventually become a major issue of the Civil War, and that is that slaves are property, not living souls. They are property. And if they are property, then their children belong as property to the masters as well. 1680, now how far are we? How slowly things have developed, how slowly the mentality has fought against sheer greed. And now we're up to 1680, and the black market is beginning to fill North America with more and more slaves. Now there's a market for it. Now the slave owners, now they feel courts are on our side. It's property. The children are property. There's much more incentive now to buy slaves than ever before. By 1793, the cotton gin is invented, and you would think, oh, that takes the pressure off. Now slaves don't have to work as hard. The cotton gin just made the demand for cotton higher. More textiles, more fashions in France, more dresses in England, and you got to get it from someplace. And so when the cotton gin was invented, it sharply increased production, it sharply increased demand, and of course, it sharply increased the requirement for more workers. But look at this. This is stunning. 1794. When were we founded? 1776. The war ended in 1783. Here is 1794. 1794, Congress, the American Congress, passes the Slave Trade Act. The Slave Trade Act prohibits the building or outfitting of ships in the U.S. ports for use and participation in the international slave trade. You might, if you have heard anything, if you have listened to, I can't remember her name, the 1619 Project author, she makes a big deal about saying even the production of ships and was built around the slave trade. You know, everything was about this, as if that just continued on and gotten bigger and bigger and exploded and never looked back. Even during Washington's presidency, he was first, right? He signed this bill prohibiting, shutting down the construction of ships designed for slave trade. 1800, the Congress passed the Slave Trade Act, which limited American involvement in the slave trade, raising fines, rewarding informants. That's a big one. Prohibiting American investment and employment in trade. Congress was trying to shut it down. By 1807, remember 1807? That's what's going on in England. 1807, the Federal Outlawing of the Importation of Slaves Act took place. And let me just read the copy here. With a presently self-sustaining population, remember, we're producing our own now. We don't have to import them. That meant that the South you could get Southern congressmen to agree to go along with some of the prohibitions on the slave trade. No skin off our nose anymore. We don't depend on it anyway. And so the North and the South came together enough to stop the trade. U.S. Congress acts to prohibit the importation of slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from any kingdom, place, or country. These are positive things. Who talks about this? No one. Did you learn this in history? No. Do you hear about it in all of the silly arguments for, the BLM arguments today? No. Roughly 400,000 slaves out of 12 million, eventually, that were shipped, that took that middle passage across the Atlantic, out of 12 million total, only 400,000, not even 500,000, made it to North America. But by the time trade ceased, the number of slaves in North America had expanded to close to 4 million. They're growing like leaps and bounds. Production of your own children is on the move, and with it, of course, all the brutality that I spoke about. Comes up to 1818. United States federal law prohibits providing for fines, imprisonment, confiscation of vessels. The increasing aim of the federal government to outlaw trade and abolish slavery was thwarted by a lack of ships and men to patrol the American and African coasts effectively. We didn't have enough police. We didn't have enough Coast Guard to make these laws work effectively. But they were there. They were on the books. Meanwhile, juries in the South were beginning to lean toward the slave owners. They knew which side of the bread the butter was on. They knew who was going to vote for them and who wasn't. And so the juries started leaning more towards the slave owners, the black market smugglers. We're going to look the other way. Everything's going to be fine down here in the South. And so between 1808 and 1860, that period of time I was talking about, while Congress is legislating all these positive things, black market is shipping in over 250,000 more slaves into the United States. You get to 1820, and there's the Missouri Compromise. Do you understand what the Missouri Compromise was? My wife is teaching the Missouri Compromise right now in the 6th grade, and it was a compromise that regarding the whole idea of will we allow future states to be slave owning or not? And the compromise was as well, Maine is wanting to get in, that's anti-slavery. Missouri is wanting to stay out, participate, so we'll let them in, and we're also going to ban slavery north of the 36th latitude. Anybody know what that is? The Mason-Dixon line. Which side of the Mason-Dixon line does Maryland fall? We're south of it. I found this quotation. This is stunning. You remember Thomas Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson is painted in history books as, he had slaves. He slept with a black woman. He had children by her. He was pro-slavery. This is what he said about the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell, the death knell, he means, of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. He says the Civil War is coming. Jefferson said that. Okay, back with Wilberforce in England, 1822. He helps to form something called the Anti-Slavery Society. Getting groups of people to work together to change culture, to change society. He writes another pamphlet by 1823. This is an appeal to stop slavery completely. We stopped the trade, but now we're after the whole thing. We want the whole 9 yards, as they say. And this pamphlet is titled An Appeal to the Religion, Justice, and Humanity of the Inhabitants of the British Empire on behalf of the Negro slaves in the West Indies. An appeal to the humanity. He's pulling out the stops. He's not speaking tongue-in-cheek anymore. He is speaking directly to their consciences and wants them to wake up. He strives to implore the nation and the empire on moral grounds. Again, he avoids necessarily the specific Christian argument. He doesn't say, the Bible says. He just simply appeals to their moral conscience, which has been lifted now because of the changes in the culture. He speaks to the presumed ignorance of the continued atrocities and wants to shock his readers into action. He accuses slaveholders of their cruelty and immorality and appeals to the conscience of the nation to join his side. It's a very, very much more targeted pamphlet than even his booklet was. And in doing my research, I came across a quotation that really speaks of how we view that stuff today, how historians view this today. He says, students of history and the African slave trade will find Wilberforce's blend of empathy for the slaves and disregard for their native faiths paradoxical. He does not have respect for their native faiths. They have to become Christian. He says it's paradoxical, if not emblematic of his time. He doesn't get it. There is no motivation to change cruelty if there isn't a Christian influence. And that's one of the main reasons why we're seeing the horror of our society deteriorating right before our eyes today, is because they're trying at every level to get rid of the Christian influence. And they're doing it with with that same level of parity. Well, your religion is as good as anybody's. No, it's not. Christianity is superior at every single level. And changing the culture only happens with a Christian world and life view. Parliament remained stubborn. It didn't want to move. It would delay. It would come up with all kinds of tactics to put off any further legislation regarding slavery. Wilberforce writes in his diary, "Never almost in my life have I been so vexed at parliamentary proceeding. Even he, who is a professional parliamentarian, he knows how to play the game. He knows how this works. He's got it all in his hand. Even he is absolutely frustrated and he's coming up empty again all the time. Finally there is a proposal on the floor of Parliament for a gradual abolition. And Wilberforce doesn't want it because he knows that a gradual abolition will never happen. They'll say it started, it will never come to a completion. You've got to cut it off. And so he was very discouraged at that. Meanwhile, 1823, a slave rebellion broke out in British Guyana. It was called the Demerara Rebellion. It was largely nonviolent. It was just a protest. It was led by a pastor. The press didn't like it, and they blamed Wilberforce for it. It's all Wilberforce's fault. And like other rebellions had been treated, this one was quashed immediately and harshly. Now think about this. Parliament will not abolish slavery with one fell swoop. We're going to let it coast to a stop and die its own natural causes. But if those slaves rebel against us, we're going to knock them dead. We're going to put it down right now because money talks. And it hasn't stopped talking. 1824, Wilberforce is just about done. He gives his last speech to Parliament. He's always struggled with that poor health, as I said. He came close to death a couple of times, more than a couple of times. His doctors said to his wife and his family, "I don't think he'll make it through the week." And he bounced back. He was amazing. The Lord kept him going. But in 1825, the year after his last speech, he finally says, I need to step aside. He hands the abolition battle over to a friend of his to take it and run with it from there, but he steps aside. And very sadly, notice what the historian said about this. Wilberforce left the House of Commons without fanfare, without visiting it. There was no valedictory speech or ceremony of departure. It brought an end to a parliamentary career spanning 45 consecutive years. They hardly noticed he was gone. In 1827, he writes in his diary, "I'm like a bee that has lost its sting." He was pretty hopeless about bringing this to a conclusion. In 1831, there was another rebellion. These are the most notorious ones that come to history's recognition. This was in Jamaica. It was called the Baptist War because it was led by a Baptist deacon. It involved 60,000 out of 300,000 slaves. It was more violent, but it was also quashed also very successfully. But just a couple of years later, petitions started to roll in against slavery to Parliament in more and more and more ways, making the parliamentarians more and more nervous and afraid for their positions. Wilberforce was asked to come out of retirement to speak at a place called Maidstone to call up to strengthen the petition in that town that was going to be sent to their member of Parliament. It was the very last speech of his life. He says, "I trust that we now approach the very end of our career." 1 month later than that, on the 14th of May, Lord Stanley, who I won't go into who he is, stood up at the dispatch box in the Commons. In other words, he's in the House of Commons, and he stands up to speak. And he proposes a government motion for the abolition of slavery. He's going to finish the job. And he did so with a glowing salute to Wilberforce. He said, "Wilberforce still remains to see, I trust, the final consummation of the great and glorious work which he was one of the first to commence, and to exclaim like the last of the prophets, 'Lord, now let thy servant depart in peace.'" As his bodily strength drained away, the liberation for which William Wilberforce had hoped and worked almost all of his adult life was at last coming into view. He had already left Parliament. He was not there, but the cause did not die and was being carried forward. 1833, on February 26th, Wilberforce received news that the Abolition of Slavery Bill, requiring the end of slavery throughout the entire British Empire, along with the payment of £20 million to the slave owners. What do you hear today about recompense, reparation? It's not a new idea, folks. In compensation was secure in its passage through the House of Commons. And this is how Wilberforce reacted to it. You know, you and I would say, "What? Are you nuts? You're going to pay these guys after all they've done? You're going to pay these?" Listen to what he says. "Thank God," said Wilberforce, "that I should have lived to witness a day in which England is willing to give 20 million sterling for the abolition of slavery. At least they're willing to buy it. If they can't get it any other way, they buy it. They're willing to do it, isn't it? That's wonderful, isn't it? To get rid of slavery." From August 1834, 800,000 slaves in the colonies of the British Empire would hear the news that they were then technically free men. That same year, Wilberforce's condition proceeded to deteriorate sharply. He had done his job. The Lord says, "Fine, you're done." He says, he said on his deathbed to his wife and son, "I'm in a very distressed state." And his son Henry said, "Yes, but you have your feet on the rock." And he died on July 29th. Now, I dare not leave the story there. Slavery ended. That's the end of the story in that day and age. The change in culture continued in some monumental ways. Remember I said in the first address, we think, Reformation of manners sounded so silly compared to the abolition of slavery. But both of them were his lifelong efforts, and as such, they caught on with many other people in significant places. Let me just give you a few of those samplings. Oh, by the way, first, before I do that, he was honored by Parliament. Wilberforce and his wife had already made arrangements to have him buried in the family plot in Hull, and that was the plan. Parliament pleaded with the family that he be buried at Westminster Abbey. And they made this proclamation: "We, the undersigned members of the Houses of Parliament, being anxious upon public grounds to show our respect for the memory of the late William Wilberforce, and being also satisfied that public honors can never be more fitly bestowed than upon such benefactors of mankind, earnestly request that he be buried in Westminster Abbey, and that we and others who may agree with us in these sentiments may have permission to attend his funeral." And the pallbearers that bore his casket were some of the highest-ranking officials in the British Empire. Quite an honor. That's the statue that resides in Westminster Abbey. Okay, one of the first ones I want to show you is Lord Shaftesbury. He's kind of a no-nonsense kind of looking guy, isn't he? London's population had exploded from 1800 to 1890, basically, a period of a century, from less than 1 million to 5 million people. The Industrial Revolution was a great part in contributing to this. And you remember that I said that children as young as 5 years old went to work because everybody had to contribute to paying rent for the house or buying food on the table. And they would work 50 or 60 hours a week, or else they worked the streets. The young boys would be urchins, they would be pickpockets, they would be thieves, they would be opportunists, the term well, anyway. Anyway. The girls, by the time they were 11 years old, became prostitutes. There were probably 80,000 prostitutes during this period of time on the streets. Living conditions were grossly overcrowded. You either shared a small apartment with dozens of people, or else you slept under the stairs or in a dark corner. You did what you could. Whole families didn't exist. You fended for yourself. Lord Shaftesbury was a parliamentarian. He was a devout Christian. He attended Wilberforce's funeral. He was affected deeply by Wilberforce in his life. He labored on changes including the provision of housing for the poor, prohibition of women and children working in the coal mines, the provision of care for the insane. Who cares for the insane? Establishing a 10-hour workday, outlawed children working as chimney sweeps, improved the water supply. Who would have thought of that? The water supply needed to be purified. He supported no less than 33 philanthropic organizations during his lifetime. He looks like a low-nonsense guy, but he obviously has a heart of gold. Another one you might have heard of is Florence Nightingale. She also lived in the contemporary post-Wilberforce era. In her day, nursing was a four-letter word. If you were a nurse, it meant it was just another term for a prostitute. It was just another term for somebody who was drunk and looking for an easy life. Proper ladies, in which she was raised in a proper home, they dressed in fine coats with lots of petticoats. They had gotten all the fabric from the West Indies, and they were dressed to the nines. And they would keep fine houses, they would give parties, and engage in brilliant conversation demonstrating the educational level they had. And yet the Crimean War, which we haven't even mentioned so far, was from 1853 to 1856. Florence told her mother she was going to go into nursing. Her mother hit the ceiling. She knew what that meant culturally, and she said she argued with her and she hated the idea. But Florence Nightingale went in with a sincere Christian heart. She had become a Christian when she was 16. She was determined to enter the field. She made a proficient impact in her ministry during the Crimean War. When things developed and she had a following, she took 38 more nurses that followed after her style and went to the war front, where they opened up field hospitals and they opened up kitchens. They brought in supplies, laundry services. The death rate among the soldiers fell from 42% to less than 3%. Very significant. She received the British Order of Merit, which is the highest order that a civilian can receive in England. Nothing's higher in this kind of salute. She wrote 2 books on the subject, Hospital Administration of the British Army and Notes on Nursing. All of the other European nations borrowed from Florence Nightingale in how she took care of soldiers. Incredible impact. Another one was Robert Raikes. Maybe you've heard of him. In his day, you know, we go back to London in those days, the Industrial Revolution. The kids are working from 5 years old up. There's no education. They put in 60 hours a week or maybe more during the summer when the daylight's there. And the only day they have off is Sunday. Why they have Sunday off? Who knows? They didn't go to church. They surely didn't go to church. What they did was loiter. What are you going to do? It's a day off. I'm hungry. Start fights, steal, rabble-rouse, get into gangs, do all kinds of things, whatever you're going to do to stay alive, because Monday's coming and you're going to have to go back to work. Robert Rakes, he says, well, if we can't have school on the other days of the week, we'll do it on Sunday. And he started his Sunday school from 10 a.m. and it went till 5 p.m. with a lunch break, and there was a chapel service in the midst of it as well. Using the day effectively, getting the kids off the street, teaching them something that would make an improvement in their lives. His goal was to prevent vice, to encourage good work habits, cheerful submission to God, the law, and their station of life. The program grew with a national phenomenon. He started off with just a small group of people. You might remember the lady in the Chatham Circle. She started off with no more than 90. By the time he reached 1830, there were 1.25 million students enrolled in this program throughout the empire. King George III said he wished every child in the kingdom could be taught to read the Bible like this. Eventually, he made a couple of mistakes. Eventually, he gave the operating of the school over to the government. That started public school. We know how well that works, don't we? And, of course, the whole idea declined rapidly. Didn't take the government long to say, we don't need the Bible in here. We don't need to teach Christianity. And as one historian said rather pointedly, he said, Sunday school has devolved to just suit the neat and clean followers of Christians as they go to church. And we do more than that here. But it shows a lack of respect in the result that was so great an impact in their culture to deteriorate to entertainment in this historian's mind. Another one was Thomas Chalmers. Did anybody remember Thomas Chalmers? Scottish Presbyterian. Da-da-da. All right? He was helping out Wilberforce to dismantle discrimination in England. Anglicanism had been that established religion in England, you know. Catholics, Jews, nonconformists were disadvantaged. They had previously been illegal. You couldn't do it, you'd get arrested. They were ostracized, they had no voice. Thomas Chalmers was more a contemporary of Wilberforce. He was a professor at Edinburgh College during these days. And he argued that religious error, and that's how he viewed Catholicism, he said religious error is no grounds for political disenfranchisement and intolerance. And through his work, 1828, the Test and Corporations Act was repealed. The 1858 was Catholic and Jewish emancipation, which I've already mentioned that Wallace was participating in as well. So Thomas Chalmers was in on that effort as well. A very benevolent thing for a Presbyterian to do. He could have been very satisfied saying, yeah, Catholics shouldn't have a voice. And he said, they're Britishers. They have a right to be heard. They have a right to be in Parliament if they're elected. Well, this was something that England was scared to death of. But by 1858, they're going to make it happen. I think one more is Elizabeth Fry. Elizabeth Fry was a devoted Christian and by 18 years of age, and she made an observation of the condition of British jails. The British punitive system was horrendous by any stretch of the imagination. English prisons were overcrowded. They were packed full. You had trespassers next to murderers. and there was no effort to separate them. There was brutality among the prisoners, extreme suffering. You could be raped, you could be attacked, you could be murdered in prison. It was the English prison system was always meant for punishment, not for reform. And so from the very early days, if you stole something, you were hanged. You know, there was no gradient for that. We don't keep people in prison here. If you're in prison, it's only for an amount of time, and then you're hanged. If you're guilty, you're hanged. We just get rid of you. Women in prison would overfill the cells with no privacy or respect granted. This included no bathrooms, nothing of the sort. Children were confined with their mothers. If you were arrested stealing to feed your child, and you and your child were locked up, they didn't want to hear about it. There was begging, and drunkenness and nakedness were very common. Elizabeth Fry started working with the homeless and helped establish a school for nurses. And by time 1811, she began visiting Newgate Prison. Newgate was one of the largest and most notorious prisons. And she began visiting it. You're going to do what? You're going to visit a prison? Why? What are you going to do there? And she founded a women's society to provide food and clothing and instruction and employment. She taught the prisoners the Bible, habits of sobriety, order, and industry. How far is she going to get, you think? Amazingly, transforming the British system from the inside out. It was stunning, her effect. Of course, we know it was the Lord. But her effort proved to make a remarkable prison transformation. And that also attracted international interest and application. Prisons have never been the same in Europe since then. I'll just leave you with this quote that I think we even read this morning. Jesus says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it for one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. Okay, any questions or comments? Yeah, Dan.
I know this isn't a question with an easy answer, but I'm left wondering, Wilberforce's worldview changed the trade in Britain. Why didn't the Christians in the southern United States have the same worldview change to get rid of slavery there?
Well, it's simple. We didn't have a Wilberforce. I hope, Lord, pray for me in this. This will be a big deal. I hope to teach about Presbyterianism during the Civil War next year, in this same October period. But I already know enough to say that there were no moral heroes, even in the Presbyterians, no matter which side you take, north or south. The first thing the Presbyterians did, just like other Christian denominations, the first thing they did was they aligned themselves with their geographical conviction. If you were a Southern Presbyterian, you were pro-slavery. And if you were a Northern Presbyterian, you were anti-slavery. There was no one that I know of right now that appealed to a moral principle. It was a rights. We get a lot of that today. That hasn't died. That started with the Civil War. It's not moral, it's right. I have a right to this. I have a right to that. It's a human right that we have this, that, and the other. Morality has disappeared, and it started with the Civil War. That's why we had to fight for it. It's because nobody would appeal to our moral nature. Pam? Yeah, to a great extent they were.
Unaware.
Right, Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Uncle Tom's Cabin. And
That was an effective propaganda piece also. Yep.
were people aware of what was going on outside of the area where they
Much more so, I think. Yeah, much more so. I think there was an awareness. I don't think it was not in the same sense at all that, you remember I showed you the map with the triangle trade routes? And the only ships landing in London, the only ships landing in Great Britain had things on them. Cotton, textiles, tobacco. Oh, this is great. They didn't ever ask. They never saw slaves. They never asked where it came from. But in the United States, the Northerners knew. They knew what slavery was. They knew, and as that continued to, that anger continued to intensify, that began to make division. Yeah.
So, like Wilberforce, I mean, there were slaves in England, but like very few.
Very, very few.
But he was really stopping the slave trade, like, because did England own? I guess they owned some places in the West Indies, or.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
So yeah, that's where he was mainly focused on.
Right. The West Indies, Brazil, Central America. That's where all the sugar crops were grown. That's where all the tobacco was. That's where all the cotton was. That's where all the industry was.
And so did he stop? He stopped the slave trade in those places that England owned.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Great Britain, and by this time Great Britain spans the globe. So it wasn't just in England. It was all over. England's exposure to slavery was limited. Nobody worked the fields in England. It was limited to servants of the upper classes who were always dressed fine, who would always be healthy looking, who were never oppressed. And that was, if there was any picture you had of slavery, that's what you had. Well, I don't see anything that bad. They're doing fine. They didn't see what slaves down in the West Indies had to endure. Joyce?
I'm just curious, I've never heard anything about slaves in Brazil. Whatever, in a very short explanation, did they eventually free their slaves and everything? I guess they must have.
I don't know about South America, and forgive me if this sounds prejudiced, South America was predominantly Roman Catholic. Roman Catholicism, from the Pope down, from the very earliest days of the European slave trade, was for it. The Pope even said at one point in the early days of the slave trade, he even said, you can have slaves as long as they're Christian. And so they would hose them down and say, okay, you've been baptized, get on the boat. Even the Pope was he was pacifying his own people because his own people wanted the prophets. So Roman Catholicism was always for it. All of South America, for all intents and purposes, is Roman Catholic. And so it went on in Roman Catholicism in spades. The vast majority of the slaves went to South America. And I honestly don't know how that turned out.
I think I know a little bit. There's a bunch of rebellions because there's so many slaves now.
Yep.
In a lot of countries, the majority of the population have African descent.
Yep. I mean, you can't ship that many millions of people over and have them disappear. They become part of the population without any problem. What? Martha, is that you?
I just want to say that what you just said about South America and Catholicism and slavery, it's like what the Bible is all about.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the Lord has the final say, and He can bring anybody and everybody to the Lord.
Oh yeah.
Who wants to.
Oh yeah.
And I've never
Right.
The Lord worked.
Oh, yeah. Lord wouldn't have forgotten them. Yeah.
I think, just one more comment, like, in Africa right now and in South America, it's the fastest growing evangelical church down there. And it's like, it was the leader, one of the speakers at the last conference says, the next missionaries aren't going to come from Europe and America, they're going to come from South America and Africa in the next, like,
Lord willing, wouldn't that be wonderful? A growing and thriving church. Praise God.
it means that, like, the North
Is going to need them.
is dying.
Oh, yeah. I think you're right. Yes, Pastor Nick.
Well, I've had off of preaching all this past month, so I must lead us in giving thanks to you.
By all means.
But my second thing is an announcement that I forgot this morning. Somebody else might remember more clearly. I didn't bring my phone with me, but we'll be looking for an email this week, probably coming out Monday, about what to bring for our missions dinner on Sunday evening.
Yeah, the stewards did give us an advance notice, and we forgot to spread that out.
So it'll be half us are bringing this and half us are bringing that.
Right.
You remember we're doing a slightly new system where it's just a potluck of the whole. So be looking for that this week, and please come to hear Reverend Charles Biggs.
Yes.
Pastor Barker will be away on vacation. I will be away speaking at another local church on family worship. But Kurt will be emceeing, and Mr. Biggs will be telling us about his work.
Very good. All right, let's pray.